Hey there, my name is Wayne Messam II. I am the audio lead for Never, and this is an audio programming devlog I made for the first-person puzzle game. Affectionately naming our team Little Drones, we have a member count of around 20 spread out across the world, remotely working in different countries. We initially banded together to make this project as a portfolio piece for our respective disciplines, but ended up continuing to work on more projects as time went on. I was the sole audio developer with the exception of another composer who had to pull out of the project early in development due to illness. Luckily, he was able to provide a soundtrack for the main menu of Never before doing so, but nonetheless, I essentially had the opportunity to create and implement the audio system for this project. My main purpose for making this devlog is to basically demonstrate my contribution to this specific project as audio lead. So I'll be covering what my role encapsulated, how I utilize my specialty in audio system creation and implementation using C#, Never's current audio system, and what I do differently next time. My role as audio lead for this project included acting as sound designer, composer, dialogue editor, and audio programmer. As the sound designer of this project, I used Logic Pro X and Pro Tools to produce, design, mix, and master the 70 sound effects with multiple variations for most. This included both linear audio, like the launching sequence that initiates when the player first enters the game, and non-linear audio from the game objects in gameplay, like the transition into cyberspace. As a composer for the project, the obvious choice for the type of music to produce for the game was definitely ambient music. I felt as though it was fitting for a ship in space without conscious crew members and was run by automated drones. What wasn't so obvious was my realization of merging all the corresponding gameplay levels with interactive ambient music, since the game had multiple similar environments and we were so shorthanded. That could definitely cut down time for production on my end and also gave the gameplay world a cohesive musical journey rather than six relatively similar soundtracks. As dialogue editor for the project, I had a hand in receiving over 200 dialogue lines from two very talented voice actors for the project, including some Easter egg content.
Gaslight, gatekeep, girl boss, little drone.
Matthew Campbell as Cyrillus, captain of the starship, and Meredith Nudo as Wendy, the ship's AI. Though we worked remotely, I was able to choose out of their clean takes of the dialogue lines and design the vocal lines for Wendy and Cyrillus, and even contribute to the emotional direction the actors took in their various lines, both technically through their design.
Do you think me deranged, little drone? Do you think I'm mad? Broken, like your dead comrades?
And literally through the notes of the scripts that were sent to them. As the audio programmer for the project, I had a hand in implementing the assets of all the aforementioned disciplines. I created a cohesive audio system, both creatively and technically, in order to execute the primary driver of the game, which was the story. Using a combination of multiple audio sources, a sequencing and event system, audio managers, scriptable objects, and more, I was able to execute all of the assets as intended for all audio made. My interpretation of system creation and implementation is the process of taking a game's concept and engineering a practical and efficient audio system that is easily executable. My objectives for this project is, in terms of utilizing my specialty, are the following: having the player experience audio files at the correct time with the least complex system possible using native Unity audio engine, implement a dynamic dialogue system with multiple narrative endings and Easter eggs, implement an innovative and interactive music/ambient system based on player position, and creating a unique audio experience for the player overall. For the first-person player controller, there are many cameras attached to it in order to switch between game modes of cutscene and gameplay. On some of these cameras are audio listeners for the player to receive audio for their audio sources, and the game is programmed in a way to enable and disable these cameras to fit the game's needs at a certain point in gameplay. This is how the player is able to hear the audio source game objects I attached on them, such as a main audio source on the player game object itself for the footsteps, and 5 other audio source game objects attached as children. Most of these audio sources are used for different scenarios and gameplay that would need to be heard at the same time, such as different types of sound effects and a transition between ambience and music zones. The audio listener on the player game object is also able to pick up additional environmental sound effects emanating from props in the game world based off of range using raycasting. Throughout the game, there are multiple instances where the player goes through game state changes, whether they are transitions between reality and the cyber world or transitions between multiple gravity options. The sound effects that are triggered through those changes uses the Unity event system from the Game World Manager and Play Audio command script, using and defining serialized fields to be able to trigger the sound effects from any point the player is at on their narrative journey at the appropriate time. The priority of the overall game is to give an immersive narrative story, and that is achieved through a sequencing system that is an extension of the Unity event system that I utilized in the game. This is extremely beneficial for certain sound effects and dialogue lines as it acts as a big part of our dialogue system. How this sequencing system works is basically getting the game to recognize the point of the narrative adventure that the player is in using game objects in a specific sequential order. The thing about these game objects is that they have an event system tailored specifically for any of the possible commands or script functions that needs to be executed in order to progress through the game's story. Some commands change the game world, some make the game areas more accessible, and some execute dialogue lines, all of which happen in succession with each other based on whether there is a condition or progression or not, such as a player passing through a specific trigger or having a specific item. The sequencing system dynamic is a nice middle ground between the puzzle functionalities of the game and the audio cues for dialogue lines. Getting more specific on the audio management of the game, dialogue lines specifically go through a process of utilizing a play audio command script for scriptable objects in order to be utilized in the playable audio script. This script both delegates the dialogue, or any of the other audio for that matter, into one of the 5 aforementioned audio sources attached to the player and displays the correct subtitles based on both my calibrations and the dialogue line that is specifically being played. This could also be further utilized on sound effects and music subtitles for future projects. This is how the player is able to utilize the audio listener through their experience should the playable audio script not have the PA audio Boolean checked. In Never specifically, I wanted to utilize my specialty in order to make the experience more immersive rather than simply having dialogue lines solely playing off of audio sources connected to the player. This ambition materialized into the idea of making the cyberworld dialogue lines of Wendy and Cyrillus play off of the audio sources as a voiceover in the head of the player drone, while the reality dialogue lines come from the innovatively integrated PA system. The goal of this was to give a unique audio experience that wouldn't typically be done, and it paid off narratively.
Attention all crew. This is your captain speaking. By 1700 hours today, we will all be entering cryosleep until we reach N3 VR. It is imperative that you enjoy the safety and comfort of the VIPs before you enter cryo yourself. Lieutenant Engineers Jackson and Adelaide, do not forget to quadruple check the status of Wendy and its crew before you enter cryo.
My crew has already been prepared, Captain. I've personally seen to it.
That may be so, but I still would prefer my men to look over you as well. What would happen if something went wrong?
I assure you, Captain, I would and could never do anything that goes against my primary directive. Impressive. Do you wish to express ship, Hero? Very well, very well then. I will not allow my charge to follow your primary directive. As we all must.
Using all of those tools in the markup of the game to its final test runs and quality assurance trials, I am quite proud of the journey and the way the project was executed. In terms of the sound design of the game, I programmed some sound effects through the sequencing system and some through triggers, not including the sounds radiating on loop from certain game objects, such as the tree ambience you hear now. This was an intentional decision after running into a few logistical pitfalls, especially as it relates to the ambience layers. One of which being that I was using the sequencing system in order to trigger the ambiences based on the narrative and mapping instead of just using simple triggers based on mapping alone. This mistake would prevent the player from transitioning back to the same ambience as the room before, because the ambience audio is dependent on the player following a linear story rather than their own experience. The simple solution to this problem was basically incorporating a fade in / out function for the triggers in the form of 2 audio sources out of the 5 audio sources present on the player. As I stated before about the music system for Never, there are at least 7 to 8 opportunities for different soundtracks for the game. Because there were only 2 composers and one had to pull out early, I did what I had to do in order to expedite the process, and I think it turned out for the best since it manifested into a robust music system for the game using horizontal layering. This style of composing made it possible to separate the music emanating from the music audio source attached from the player based on the room the player was in. If the player was in any of the music major areas such as the bridge, central control hub, power core, or life support unit, they would hear a different layer of the music, with the exception of the cryopod bay where they hear the whole song in its entirety. If the player was positioned in the hallways or corridors of the ship, they would just hear a base layer of the music until they reach the next destination. This was achieved by exporting all the different layers as they would be playing in each area and mapped / implemented the correct triggers in order to cue the audio clips with the playable audio script when the player enters the corresponding area. A similar pitfall and resolution occurred here when I thought of the similarities in the music system and the way the ambience was supposed to be integrated. The main difference between the two is that the music was more successful with the sequencing system, since it was able to transition back and forth after tweaking the conditions of the sequencing system for it. Thus, only one audio source was needed for the background music for the game at all times. With the dialogue system, it was one of the 2 core components to the sequencing system that made the game have a sense of progression, both narrative and gameplay specifically. Using game objects to trigger the scriptable objects through the playable audio command script was the core foundation in utilizing Unity's event system in a way that progressed the game seamlessly. As I stated before, this allowed us to, as developers, to sequentially progress the gameplay with commands and functions that are triggered under the right conditions. The biggest issue with this dialogue system was its heavy reliance on sequence success. At first, this was a devastating experience for dialogue testing, but with the developer mode, we were able to expedite the story to the needed places in order to test the correct story elements. However, the dependency on certain puzzles being completed without flaw also contributed to delays in finding dialogue bugs. Puzzle bugs would need to be fixed before the dialogue bugs. Luckily, the developer mode helped with testing, and the most common issues we found had to do with the functionality of the subtitles rather than the audio lines being played correctly. This project used scriptable objects, so organization of the project was a prime necessity. For coding, I used camel casing, but for asset file management, I made sure to have a full assortment of categories specified in the file name with the following method in order to make sure each audio file went to the correct scriptable object that would go into the correct dialogue line game object to be sequentially triggered at the correct time. Last but absolutely not least is the PA system of the ship. Wendy speaks both directly to the player and through video logs of the past with Cyrillus. During gameplay, the player would travel the ship, Hearing her addressing the drone through the PA system, which consisted of prefabs that had calibrated raycasters targeting the player in order to measure the distance between the two. Using a list of audio sources created by both the PA system manager script and the sequence system game objects, the play audio command script specified whether the audio from the scriptable objects would post dialogue lines either through voiceover or the PA system. It does this by using the raycast between the player and the closest PA system prefabs to signal what PA systems would trigger the correct audio clip on the list and which PA systems wouldn't. The biggest issue with creating and calibrating the system had to do with differentiating between what PA systems were playing audio and which were not. Scripting this function was a learning experience of experimenting with different ways of playing the audio. We could have instantiated the PA systems for each part of the story based on the map area, but quickly realized how time consuming that would be rather than just using a raycast from the player position to detect the PA systems, which were already prefabs. This would determine which audio clips, which PA systems would play audio clips and which would not. Though I heavily enjoyed my experience with this project, I definitely could have done some things differently that would have saved me some time in the long run. Those two things are middleware integration and having more meetings with my programmers. I used this experience to grow my understanding of programming thought processes without relying on middleware. I think now that I have a blend of the two experiences, I can use the tools available to me in my future projects in order to create robust audio systems that could potentially utilize both pieces of software. Those two specifically being coding to create native tools and systems and middleware for variations, attenuations, and specificality. Working remotely makes it hard to fully understand different departments, but one thing I think I failed to recognize for this project specifically is that I could have definitely had more conversations with my programmers than the few meetings I had with them in order to implement the audio system above just our sequencing system. Overall, I had a great time working on this project, and I very much enjoyed being behind the audio experience of the game. The final thing I did for the game was programming the main menu theme on the main menu, which was produced by Ray Miller, and the credit soundtrack which was produced by me. So thank you for watching, and I hope you had a chance to enjoy the game.